She was blind, black, and walking in her favorite park, until a police officer snapped her cane in half for no reason. No one helped. No one spoke up. But what happened next shook the entire town. Stay with us, because this story will challenge what you believe about justice, courage, and quiet strength. Watch until the end, like this video, and subscribe now, because stories like this deserve to be seen, heard, and remembered. There was something sacred about mornings in Pinebrook, especially for Ruth Coleman. The quiet streets, the soft rustle of leaves brushing against the sidewalks, and the sweet chill in the air gave her a sense of peace that few things could offer. Ruth, now in her 70s and blind for nearly 3 decades, had long learned how to move through the world without sight but never without purpose. Her morning walks through Rosewood Park were more than routine. They were a lifeline, a silent affirmation that she was still part of the town's heartbeat. With her cane tapping gently against the pavement, she memorized every corner, every crack in the sidewalk, every bend in the trail by the creek. It wasn't just a walk. It was freedom. That particular morning started like any other. Ruth moved gracefully down her front steps, her hand gliding lightly over the railing, her cane tapping a familiar beat along the sidewalk. She could feel the warmth of the sun brushing her face, smell the fresh scent of dew on the grass, hear the distant laughter of early joggers and the low hum of a passing truck. Everything about it felt safe, felt right. The entrance to the park greeted her with the usual creaky swing of the iron gate. Her favorite bench beneath the old oak tree wasn't far. She could already sense the gravel underfoot and the slight tilt in the path where the tree roots had pushed up the walkway over the years. But peace has a way of inviting disruption. Heavy footsteps crunched behind her, too sharp, too purposeful. Ruth slowed, gripping her cane a little tighter, the rhythm of her walk faltering for just a second. A man's voice called out, sharp and clipped, not offering help but questioning her presence like she didn't belong there. Ruth, with the patience born from years of resilience, kept her tone steady and polite. She explained she knew the park well, that she walked here most mornings. But the air around her shifted, thickened with something heavy and unwelcome. She could feel it in the way he hovered too close, in the weight of his silence after each exchange. Without warning, he stepped closer. She barely had time to brace herself before she felt a violent tug. In a single brutal motion, the officer yanked her cane from her grasp. Ruth's body stumbled forward, her hands flailing into empty air, desperate for balance. Then came the sound. The awful, splintering crack of wood snapping under force. Her cane, the one that had guided her, supported her, given her independence, broken and discarded like trash at her feet. For a moment, the world around her fell silent, except for the echo of that crack ringing in her ears. Ruth knelt down slowly, her fingers trembling as they searched the gravel for the broken pieces. Her hands found the jagged edges of the cane, the smooth, worn handle that once belonged to her late husband, the one he had given her with pride and love. Around her, she could feel the stares of bystanders. People saw. People knew. But no one moved. No one spoke. She was left to gather the fragments of her dignity alone, scraping the broken pieces of her independence into her arms while the officer's heavy boots stomped away without a care. The weight of that moment pressed down on her chest harder than any physical blow could have. Ruth stood slowly, holding the shattered cane against her heart. Every step she took away from the park that morning was heavier than the last. She wasn't just walking without sight now. She was walking with a fresh wound no one could see. A wound made not just from cruelty, but from the silence of a world that chose to look the other way. And yet, she kept moving. Because that's what Ruth Coleman had always done. No matter how many times life tried to break her, she always kept walking. Ruth Coleman sat at her kitchen table long after the sun had climbed high above Pinebrook, her fingers absently tracing the rim of a cold cup of tea she had forgotten to drink. The broken pieces of her cane, wrapped carefully in a faded dish towel, lay on the table in front of her like a quiet reminder of everything that had gone wrong. She couldn't bring herself to throw them away. It wasn't just wood that had been shattered that morning. It was something deeper, something that no towel or glue could ever put back together. The house around her felt smaller now. The walls, once a comfort, now pressed in around her, the air heavy with a kind of sorrow she hadn't felt in years. Ruth had lived through so much already, losing her sight, losing her husband, carving a life out of the spaces others often overlooked. But this this was different. It wasn't just about losing a cane. It was about losing a piece of herself, a piece that had been painstakingly rebuilt after years of grief, struggle, and perseverance. And now, with a snap and a crowd of silent witnesses, it had been taken from her all over again. All day, Ruth tried to shake it off. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that it was just a thing. Things could be replaced. But when she moved through the house, she felt it in every cautious step. She used to glide through these rooms by memory, her cane an extension of her will. Without it, she had to stretch her hands out like a stranger in her own home, feeling for door frames, brushing walls, counting steps again. Every missed reach, every stumble, reminded her that something precious had been broken beyond repair. Worse than the physical loss was the humiliation. It clung to her skin like a film she couldn't scrub off. She kept hearing the officer's voice in her head, the sharpness of his tone, the dismissal in his words. She kept feeling the weight of the onlookers' silence, the way their footsteps had hesitated but never approached. In her mind, she replayed every second of it. She wondered if she should have fought back, said more, stood taller. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't have mattered. Some battles weren't meant to be fought in the moment. Some were meant to be endured, to be remembered for what they revealed about the world around you. That night, sleep did not come easily. Ruth lay awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of her town outside the window, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the hum of a passing car, the creak of old trees swaying in the wind. Normally, those sounds comforted her. They reminded her she was part of something living, breathing, connected. But tonight, they felt distant, muted, like she had been pushed just far enough outside of her own life to watch it all unfold without her. She thought about the officer, about what had driven him to such cruelty. Was it anger? Hatred? Fear? She didn't know. Maybe he had simply seen her as an inconvenience, an easy target for whatever frustration he carried around. Whatever it wasn't new. Ruth had seen different versions of that same ugliness her whole life, worn different masks but always carrying the same poison underneath. It was the kind of hate that didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it showed up with a forced smile or a heavy hand resting just a little too long on your freedom. Still, the part that hurt the most wasn't him. It was the people who watched and did nothing. That hurt in a way she hadn't expected. Ruth had lived in Pinebrook for decades. She knew the faces, the voices, the small kindnesses exchanged over grocery counters and at church bake sales. She believed, maybe foolishly, that in a moment of need, someone would step forward. Someone would say, "This isn't right." But no one had. And that silence spoke louder than the officer ever could. By morning, Ruth knew she couldn't keep pretending nothing had changed. Her broken cane was more than just a loss of mobility. It was a crack in the foundation of how she saw herself in her town, her place among her neighbors. She wasn't invisible. She never had been. But now she understood that to some people, her dignity was optional, her suffering acceptable if it meant avoiding discomfort. Still, Ruth Coleman was not built to surrender. She felt the grief, let it pass through her like a cold wind through an open window. And then, somewhere deep inside, she found a small, stubborn flame still burning. It wasn't roaring yet. It was quiet, tender. But it was there. She didn't know exactly what would come next. She only knew she wasn't done walking, and she wasn't done fighting for the right to move freely through the world, cane or no cane. Marcus Coleman was already behind the wheel before the sun stretched its first rays across the Georgia sky. His bag was still half-packed in the back seat, a jacket tossed across the passenger chair, a few important files he barely remembered grabbing before heading out the door. None of that mattered. What mattered was the call from his mother the night before, short and careful, filled with reassurances he knew better than to believe. Ruth Coleman never called unless something was wrong. And when she insisted everything was fine, that was when Marcus knew it wasn't. The miles rolled by under his tires, but his mind was somewhere else, racing faster than he was driving. He kept replaying her voice, the slight tremble at the edge of it, the kind of tremble you wouldn't catch if you didn't know her like he did. Pinebrook was a few hours from Atlanta, but that morning it felt like another world. As he crossed into town, familiar sights greeted him. The old gas station with a flickering sign, the rows of pine trees that had stood like quiet sentinels his whole life, the cracked sidewalks he used to race down as a kid. But even with all the familiarity, something in the air felt different. He couldn't name it exactly, just a heavy stillness pressing down, like the whole town was holding its breath. Marcus pulled into the driveway of his childhood home, a white cottage tucked neatly behind a row of tall hedges. The garden was still tended with loving hands. The porch still had the same creaky boards that needed fixing. It looked the same. But sitting inside was a woman who had been changed by something he hadn't yet fully seen. He stepped onto the porch and knocked once, even though he knew he didn't have to. The door creaked open slowly, and there she was. Ruth sat in her favorite chair by the window, wrapped in the old cardigan she always wore on cool mornings. She turned her head toward the sound of the door, and even without sight, her face broke into the kind of smile that had once made scraped knees and broken hearts feel small. Still, Marcus didn't miss the way her hands moved slower as she rose to greet him, or how her cane was nowhere in sight. A tight knot formed in his chest. He moved to her side, gently taking her hand. She squeezed it once, firm but tired. No words were needed right away. He guided her back to her chair, then pulled another up close. The dish towel on the kitchen table caught his eye, the one wrapped around something long and thin. Without asking, he reached out, unwrapping it carefully until the broken halves of her cane lay exposed in his hands. His heart sank. This wasn't just about a fall or an accident. This was deliberate. This was personal. He looked up at his mother, searching her face for the pieces of the story she hadn't spoken yet. Slowly, in her soft, measured way, she told him about the park, the officer, the snapping of the cane, and the way nobody had stepped in. Every word felt heavier than the last. Marcus listened without interrupting, fighting the heat rising in his chest. He was no stranger to injustice. He had worn the badge long enough to see it from every angle, but hearing it happen to his own mother, feeling the tremble in her voice as she spoke, was something he wasn't prepared for. When she finished, she rested her hands in her lap and turned her head slightly toward him. She didn't ask him to fix it. She didn't need to. He saw it in the way she held herself, proud but a little smaller than before. That silent request, the one she didn't want to burden him with but couldn't hide, was clear as day. He was her son. He had been raised on principles of right and wrong, of standing up even when it was uncomfortable. And now, sitting in the quiet of his childhood home, staring at the broken pieces of what had once been her independence, Marcus Coleman knew exactly what he had to do. He gathered the broken cane carefully, wrapping it back in the towel as if it were something sacred. Then he placed a hand over his mother's and gave it a small, reassuring squeeze. She had carried the weight of dignity, of survival, for decades. It was his turn now. He would carry this fight for her. For all the mornings she had walked proud through the world. For all the moments she had refused to be broken. And for the one moment someone tried to take that away. Marcus stood up, his mind already racing through the next steps. He wasn't just a son today. He was a protector. And he was going to make sure Pinebrook knew it had messed with the wrong family. Marcus Coleman didn't waste time. After spending the night at his mother's house, sitting at the kitchen table with the broken cane laid out like a wound neither of them could look away from, he knew exactly what needed to be done. Pinebrook was a small town. People talked. People watched. And even when they pretended not to see, they always knew more than they let on. Marcus had grown up in that reality. He knew the rhythm of the place, the way news traveled faster than the mail truck, the way secrets slipped out when people thought no one important was listening. That morning, Marcus drove straight to Rosewood Park. The sun was barely peeking over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the gravel paths. He parked near the north entrance and scanned the area. It looked so peaceful, so ordinary, it was almost hard to imagine the cruelty that had unfolded there just days ago. But Marcus wasn't here for peace. He was here for answers. Near the edge of the park, he spotted the small vendor cart that sold coffee and pastries most mornings. The young man behind it, Tyrell, couldn't have been more than 20, wiry and nervous, his baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. Marcus approached with a steady, calm pace, not wanting to startle him. As soon as Tyrell looked up, recognition flickered in his eyes. He knew who Marcus was. Everybody in town did. Marcus asked about the morning Ruth's cane was broken. Tyrell shifted on his feet, glancing around like he was worried someone might overhear. Then, almost in a whisper, he admitted he had seen everything. Even better, he had recorded it. He explained that when he saw Officer Slater approach Ruth with that hard, angry look, something in his gut told him to hit record on his phone. He hadn't known what would happen, but he had known it wasn't going to be good. Tyrell pulled out his phone with shaking hands and played the video for Marcus right there by the cart. The grainy footage wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. The towering figure of Officer Derek Slater stepping into Ruth's path, the sharp tug as he ripped the cane from her hands, the loud, sickening crack as it snapped. Even without sound, the video captured everything that mattered: the aggression, the humiliation, the cold disregard. It made Marcus's stomach turn, but it also steeled his resolve. Tyrell offered to send the video immediately, and Marcus gave him his number without hesitation. Before leaving, he thanked the young man sincerely. Tyrell's hands still shook as he handed over a cup of coffee on the house, a small gesture that spoke volumes. In that moment, Marcus understood something important. Not everyone in Pinebrook would turn a blind eye. Next, Marcus moved through the park, scanning for anyone who might have witnessed what happened. It took time, and more than a few polite conversations that went nowhere, but eventually he found her. Samantha, a young mother pushing a stroller along the trail. She was hesitant, her eyes darting around nervously as she spoke. She hadn't been close enough to hear every word, but she had seen enough. The way Slater had towered over Ruth, the way he had yanked the cane away, the way no one had stepped in. Samantha was scared. She didn't want trouble. She had a family to think about. Marcus didn't pressure her. He gave her his card, told her to call if she decided she wanted to make a statement. He knew better than to force bravery. Courage had its own timing. By noon, Marcus had enough to start building the case. Tyrell's video was solid gold. Samantha's visual account backed up the timeline. He pulled Ruth's medical documents to show her long history of blindness and her absolute reliance on that cane. He went to the police department's records room and pulled the patrol logs, finding exactly what he suspected. Officer Slater had been patrolling the park alone at the time of the incident. No backup, no oversight. He carefully compiled everything into a folder: evidence, testimony, video footage. Step by step, he built the kind of case that wouldn't just make noise, it would demand action. Sitting back at his mother's kitchen table that evening, flipping through the documents one more time, Marcus felt a quiet certainty settle over him. This wasn't just about making noise. It was about forcing the town to see what it had tried to ignore. Ruth Coleman wasn't invisible. And by the time Marcus was done, neither would be the truth. Marcus Coleman knew that standing up meant standing out, but he hadn't expected the weight of it to settle so heavily, so fast. Filing the complaint against Officer Derek Slater was only the first step. The real battle began the moment he walked back into the Pinebrook Police Department, carrying not just a folder full of evidence but a quiet certainty that he was doing the right thing. Right didn't make it easy, though. It didn't soften the sideways glances or the sudden hush that fell whenever he entered a room. It didn't protect him from the cold shoulders of men he had once trusted with his life. At first, it was small things. A call from dispatch that somehow never made it to his radio. A critical email that mysteriously went missing when he needed it for a meeting. A simple patrol shift reassigned without explanation. Nothing big enough to be written up, nothing that screamed retaliation on paper, but Marcus recognized the pattern. It was the same slow, grinding isolation he had seen happen to other good cops who had dared to speak against the tide. The message was clear: he wasn't one of them anymore. He tried to shake it off, focusing on his work, focusing on his mother, focusing on the case. But every day the tension grew heavier. His locker was jammed one morning, stuffed with garbage, crumpled paper towels, half-eaten sandwiches, and a note scrawled with just 2 words: "Stay quiet." Another day, he found the tires of his car slashed in the parking lot. He didn't file a report. There was no point. He knew exactly how it would be handled. It would disappear into a drawer somewhere, buried under a mountain of paperwork and silent warnings. Marcus didn't show it, not on the outside. He kept his head high, his posture steady. But inside, it wore on him. The loneliness was sharp. The loss of brotherhood, of camaraderie, cut deeper than he cared to admit. He had spent his career believing in the uniform, believing that it stood for something more than just authority. Now he saw how quickly that belief could be twisted when protecting the wrong person meant preserving the illusion of unity. At home, he tried to keep it from his mother. Ruth had enough on her heart already. She didn't need to carry his burdens too. But she wasn't fooled. She saw it in the tired lines around his eyes, the way he moved just a little slower at the end of the day. She heard it in the long silences over dinner, the way he stared at nothing in particular, lost in thoughts he didn't dare say out loud. She never pressed him, never demanded to know the details. She just made sure there was always a hot meal waiting, a steady hand reaching out when he needed it. The worst of it came late one night when Marcus found a note tucked under his windshield wiper. The words were simple, the handwriting rushed and angry, back the blue or else. No signature. No explanation needed. He stood there in the dark, the note flapping gently in the cool night breeze, and let the weight of it sink in. This was what truth cost in places like Pinebrook. This was the price of refusing to stay silent. Still, Marcus refused to back down. Every threat, every dirty look, every act of childish sabotage only hardened his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for Ruth anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been told to sit down, shut up, and accept injustice as the price of peace. He knew he couldn't count on backup. He couldn't count on easy victories. All he could count on was himself, his evidence, and the simple, stubborn belief that doing the right thing was worth the storm that followed. Every night, after he locked the doors and turned off the lights, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, flipping through his notes, reviewing every piece of the case. It was exhausting. It was lonely. But it was necessary. He could still hear his mother's voice in his mind, soft but steady, reminding him of who he was raised to be. Not a man who chased comfort. A man who chased justice. The retaliation might have been loud, but Marcus's commitment was louder. And deep down, he knew he wasn't the only one listening anymore. Somewhere, in the quiet corners of Pinebrook, people were watching. Waiting. Hoping he wouldn't give up. And he wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. The day of the hearing felt heavier than any morning Marcus Coleman had faced before. He woke before sunrise, the sky outside still wrapped in deep blue shadows, and moved through his mother's quiet house with a sense of steady purpose. He didn't wear his uniform that day. This wasn't about rank or titles. It was about truth. He chose a simple dark suit, clean and plain, and packed a folder with everything he had worked for. The video footage, patrol logs, written statements from Tyrell and Samantha, and his own detailed report. It wasn't a mountain of evidence, but it was enough. Enough to pull back the curtain and force people to look at what they had been trying so hard to ignore. The hearing wasn't held in a grand courtroom or city hall. It was tucked away in a plain government building, one of those old structures with flickering fluorescent lights and a waiting room that smelled faintly of paper and stale coffee. Marcus sat alone outside the hearing room, his hands resting calmly on the folder in his lap. Across the hallway, he spotted Officer Derek Slater and his lawyer arriving. Slater looked stiff, his jaw tight, his body carrying a tension that no amount of rehearsed swagger could hide. His lawyer talked fast and low, glancing around the hall like he expected a crowd. But there was no crowd. Just them. Just the truth. When Marcus's name was called, he stood up and entered the hearing room with quiet confidence. The panel sat at a long table, 2 from Internal Affairs and 1 civilian representative. They introduced themselves quickly, laying out the procedures. Marcus answered the standard questions without hesitation, giving his name, his rank, and his years of service. Then, finally, they asked him to present his case. He started by playing the video. The footage filled the small room with the crackling, undeniable evidence of what had happened. The way Officer Slater had approached Ruth. The sudden, violent snatching of the cane. The brutal snap that seemed to echo even through the muted speaker of the phone. Marcus watched the panel members closely as they leaned forward, their faces tightening as the video played out. No words were needed. The images spoke louder than anything Marcus could say. When the video ended, Marcus laid out the timeline. Officer Slater's solo patrol assignment that morning, the lack of any reported incidents that could justify his actions, and the witness statements that backed up what everyone had seen. He spoke plainly, carefully, refusing to let emotion cloud his voice but never hiding the deep sense of wrong that fueled every word. He told them who Ruth Coleman was, not just in relation to him, but in relation to the community. A woman who had walked those park trails for decades without fear, who had built a life of quiet dignity long before any of them had put on a badge. He asked them to see her the way he saw her. Not as a victim, but as a human being who had been wronged in a way that demanded more than silence. When Marcus finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Officer Slater's lawyer began his defense. He framed the incident as a misunderstanding, a concern for public safety, a routine welfare check gone wrong. He tried to spin the story, tried to place the blame on Ruth's supposed vulnerability, her supposed confusion. But the video and the testimony left little room for doubt. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He let the evidence stand on its own. After the statements, the panel asked a few more questions. They pressed Slater's lawyer on inconsistencies, on the gaps between the official patrol logs and the story they were trying to sell. Marcus answered their questions with the same calm determination he had brought from the start. He wasn't just representing his mother. He was standing up for every silent story that had never made it this far. Finally, they adjourned to deliberate. Marcus stepped back into the waiting room, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him, but also a deep, steady pride. He had done everything he could. Now it was out of his hands. Minutes later, Slater stormed past him, his face a mixture of rage and fear. Marcus stayed seated, his hands still calmly folded, refusing to give Slater even a second of satisfaction. Not long after, the panel called Marcus back in to deliver the news. Officer Derek Slater was suspended without pay, pending further investigation and possible criminal charges. It wasn't a complete victory, not yet. But it was the first real crack in the wall. And Marcus knew once the crack started, it was only a matter of time before the whole rotten structure came crashing down. It didn't happen overnight. The town of Pinebrook was slow to move, the way small towns often are, clinging to routines and quiet corners where nothing too loud ever lingered for long. But something had shifted, something you could feel even if you couldn't quite name it. It started with the small things. People who used to cross the street or look away when Ruth Coleman passed by in the park now stopped to nod or say hello. A few even walked alongside her for a stretch, asking how she was doing, if she needed anything. It was awkward at first, fumbling and unsure, but Ruth didn't mind. She could tell when an effort was sincere, and she welcomed it with the same quiet grace she always had. Marcus saw it too. He noticed the way the town's conversations changed, little by little. At the coffee shop, at the post office, at the farmer's market, people were talking about more than weather and football scores. They were talking about fairness, about respect, about what it really meant to be a neighbor. Some of it was messy. Some people grumbled that things were fine the way they were and didn't need stirring up. But others, more than Marcus had dared hope for, leaned in and listened. They asked questions. They wondered aloud why it took something so cruel and public to open their eyes. The suspension of Officer Derek Slater sent ripples through the department too. Officers who had once ignored Marcus in the hallways now offered quiet nods, not quite apologies, but acknowledgments. Some kept their distance, unsure of where they stood. Others, a few brave ones, thanked him when no one was around to hear. Change, Marcus realized, didn't roar in all at once. Sometimes it crept in on quiet footsteps, growing in the spaces where courage finally outshouted fear. At home, Ruth was reclaiming her rhythm. Marcus had surprised her a few days after the hearing with a gift wrapped carefully in navy blue paper and tied with a silver ribbon. Inside was a new cane, polished mahogany with a smooth ivory handle that fit perfectly in her hand. Engraved on the handle were 3 simple words, "To my strength." Ruth hadn't needed a speech to understand the meaning. She had simply pressed her hand over Marcus's and nodded, a deep, silent exchange of love and gratitude that said more than words ever could. With her new cane, Ruth returned to Rosewood Park. The first few walks were tentative, the shadows of what had happened still lingering at the edges of her mind. But step by step, her confidence grew. She found her pace again, the familiar tap of the cane leading her down the paths she had once feared she might never walk without dread. Some mornings, Marcus walked with her, matching her slower steps without a hint of impatience. Other times, she went alone, A quiet force moving through the park with a dignity that no act of cruelty could erase. People noticed. Tyrell from the coffee cart always had a hot cup ready when she passed. Parents sitting by the playground lifted their hands in small waves. Even teenagers, usually wrapped in their own noisy worlds, would pause their games of tag or pick up basketball to make sure she had a clear path. The town was remembering what it meant to look out for each other, and Ruth, simply by showing up, was helping them remember. Beyond the park, real change was brewing too. Marcus had proposed something bold during a meeting with town officials. A new training program for police officers, one built not around policies tucked into dusty binders but around lived experiences, empathy, and accountability. It wasn't mandatory, not yet, but it was open to anyone willing to learn. They called it the Ruth Coleman Initiative, not because Ruth asked for it, but because her story had become a catalyst for something Pinebrook desperately needed. It was a start. A small one, maybe. But every movement, no matter how big, had to start somewhere. And in Pinebrook, it started with a blind woman refusing to be broken, a son refusing to stay silent, and a community learning, day by day, to see not just with their eyes but with their hearts. Ruth didn't need applause or parades. She had something better now, the simple, powerful knowledge that by just being herself, she had helped wake a town up. And Marcus knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. Ruth Coleman stood at the entrance of Rosewood Park, the familiar sound of wind rustling through the trees brushing past her ears. Her fingers gently wrapped around the new cane her son had given her, its smooth wood engraved with words she could feel more than read. It wasn't just a tool for walking, it was a symbol of everything she had reclaimed. After weeks of pain, humiliation, and silence, this simple act, walking back into the park, was her quiet, defiant return to herself. There was no crowd to cheer her on. No headlines followed her steps. But Ruth didn't need noise. She had walked this path before, long before Officer Slater tried to break her spirit. And now, she walked it again. Slow, steady, proud. People noticed. Some nodded. Others simply moved aside, unsure how to react. But Ruth wasn't here for validation. She was here to feel the sun on her face, to remember who she was before that terrible morning, and to remind herself that no one, not even a man in uniform, could take away her dignity. Across town, the ripple of Ruth's story had already begun to shift something in the hearts of her neighbors. At first, it was subtle, an extra moment of eye contact, a few more people speaking up when things didn't feel right. The local newspaper ran a quiet editorial, not naming names, but calling for compassion and change. More importantly, people like Tyrell and Samantha, those who had once stayed silent, now walked a little taller, knowing they had done the right thing. One voice had become two, then four, then dozens. The police department, once rigid and defensive, found itself under a new kind of pressure. Not the fire of protests, but the steady weight of truth and accountability. Marcus Coleman's evidence was clear, his approach professional, his heart unwavering. He didn't yell. He didn't demand. He simply showed what had happened and asked that justice be done. And it was. Slater had been suspended, his actions under investigation, and though the process would take time, the message was clear. No one was above accountability. The town council, shaken by what they had seen in the footage, took their first steps toward meaningful reform. They approved funding for new training programs, ones that emphasized empathy, cultural awareness, and de-escalation. They called it the Ruth Coleman Initiative. It wasn't a flashy gesture. It didn't solve every problem overnight. But it was a start. A seed planted in ground that had long been hardened by denial and silence. For Marcus, the journey had been personal. He came home as a son, but he stayed as a servant of justice. He faced backlash, isolation, and countless sleepless nights, but he never lost sight of his purpose. Every insult, every act of sabotage against him, only deepened his resolve. And when he saw his mother walking through that park again, standing tall despite the pain, he knew every battle had been worth it. Ruth didn't speak much about what happened. She didn't need to. Her presence, her resilience, said it all. And slowly, more people began to join her on her morning walks. A young man with a stutter who had once been afraid to speak up. A retired teacher who admitted she'd looked away too many times. Even Tyrell, who now carried a camera not just for business, but as a quiet protector of the truth. There were no parades, no grand speeches. Just life, inching toward something better. Pine Brook was still Pine Brook. It still had its flaws, its blind spots, its slow-to-change ways. But in the hush of a morning breeze, in the soft shuffle of Ruth's footsteps, in the engraved words on her cane, something had shifted. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about reclaiming space, about being seen, about the kind of strength that doesn't shout but endures. And in that endurance, Ruth found her victory. Not loud, not fast, but lasting. And that made all the difference. The story of Ruth Coleman teaches us that real change doesn't always come through loud protests or public applause. It often begins with quiet, courageous acts done in the face of pain and injustice. Ruth didn't ask to be a symbol, but through her strength and dignity, she became one. Her son Marcus didn't set out to be a hero, but his persistence, even when facing retaliation, reminded us that standing up for what's right often requires steady resolve rather than grand gestures. For many older viewers who have faced times when speaking out felt dangerous or even impossible, this story is a powerful reminder. Silence protects injustice, but even the smallest act of bravery, making a call, sharing the truth, showing up again, can start a ripple of lasting transformation. Dignity doesn't need noise to be felt, and justice doesn't need a spotlight to begin. Sometimes, the most powerful victories come from simply refusing to give up your ground. What about you? Have you ever witnessed quiet courage that changed everything? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if you found this video meaningful, don't forget to like it, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that inspires and uplifts. There's more to come, and we'd love to know what kind of real-life stories you want to see next.